This is an introduction of the course Evolution of Plant Interaction at the Ostrava University. The introduction is going to follow this plan. We will start by introducing what are plant interactions, then consider the ecological and evolutionary consequences of these interactions. Further, I will talk about how plant interactions are classified, what is the effect of the environment on the different types of interactions, and lastly, I will show you how we study plant interactions. I do like to start my lectures with questions, so at this stage you can pause the video and think which of the following are examples of plant interactions. This question was maybe not easy to answer if you don't know the definition of biological interactions. According to the Wikipedia definition, which is quite good, a biological interaction is the effect that a pair, it can be more than a pair of organisms, living together in a community have on each other. With this definition in mind, let's review the suggested examples. The host-parasite interaction is a very typical example of plant interaction. The parasite is completely dependent on the host for its nutrition, so it cannot survive without interaction. The host, on the other hand, is negatively impacted by the parasite in this interaction. It can survive with it, but it doesn't get to say whether it would like to have the parasite or not. The effect of pesticide on pollinator decline might not be a very obvious interaction, but it can be classified as an indirect interaction between humans and pollinators. It is the human behavior, the use of pesticides, that negatively impacts the interaction. Another classical example of interaction is the relationship between entomophilous or insect-pollinated plants and their pollinator insects. We will discuss this in detail in the plant reproduction topic. On the other hand, anemophilous or wind-pollinated plants do not interact with pollinator insects, as they use abiotic pollination vectors. So here we have a case of two species that could be a part of more diversified community which do not interact with each other. Seedlings competing for light interact with each other. Each seedling is trying to grow as fast as possible so that it outgrows all others and has prime access to light. The seedlings that do not grow as fast will be left behind in the shadows and either have a reduced growth or not survive. So, what are the ecological and evolutionary consequences of plant interactions or biological interactions in general? On an ecological scale, this will have a direct effect on plant development and performance locally. For instance, if a plant is pollinated, it would produce seeds. The number of seeds depends on the efficiency of the pollination and thus on the interaction between the plant and its pollinators. On an evolutionary scale, plant-pollinator interactions can result in selective pressures that will shape the evolution of plants and their flowers. Plants have adapted their floral morphologies to attract more pollinators that are efficient in the transfer of their pollen, which will eventually result in the evolution of new flowering species. Both ecological and evolutionary scales are intricately related to one another. The evolution of floral shapes is the result of an attempt to increase seed production during a single pollinator visit or during a single season, so to increase pollination efficiency at the ecological scale. Biological interactions are often studied for a pair of organisms because it's the simplest way to look into an interaction from an experimental point of view. And thus they can be defined by the net outcome of the interaction for the fitness of each of the interacting individuals. If the net income is positive, then we have a beneficial interaction, at least for one organism. If there is a fitness loss, then the net gain is negative, and it is a negative interaction. There can also be neutral interactions which do not affect the fitness of one or more organisms. So when both organisms have a fitness gain, a positive outcome of the interaction, this is called mutualism. And the classical example for this is the interactions between plants and pollinators, although there are exceptions of this mutually beneficial interaction between these organisms. When the interaction is beneficial for one but doesn't affect the fitness of the other organism, we're talking about commensalism. And this is the case of some epiphytic orchids, which use the tree trunk as support for their growth without affecting the growth or development of the tree. If one organism gains and the other one loses fitness from the interaction, we can talk either about parasitism, predation, or herbivory, depending on the level at which the organism that is negatively affected loses fitness. So the typical example is the one of parasitic plants, such as the mistletoe. Such as the mistletoe that can be found quite often in the region of Ostrava, or we can also have interactions with herbivores where the herbivore animals are biting off just parts of the plant. We usually do not have a lot of predation involved in plant interactions, because predation means that the organism that is negatively affected is killed completely and at once by the one that has a positive gain of the interaction. If the interaction is not affecting one of the organisms but has a negative effect on the other one, it is called amensalism. And this is typically the case of interference competition, of which we can find also plenty of examples in the Beskid Mountains around Ostrava, where pine trees are shedding their needles on the soil, which increase the soil acidity and thus prevent other plants from growing at the soil around them. This does not affect the fitness of the pine trees per se, because they will be shedding their needles anyways, but it does have a negative effect on anything that might try to grow underneath. And lastly, we can have an interaction that is negative for both organisms, and this is typically the case of competition. And here is the result of a small pilot trial that I did in the greenhouse of the Ostrava University, where you can see that the same plant species is growing much bigger in the pot on the right, where there is only one seedling growing by itself, compared to the pot on the left, where I have about 100 of seedlings growing together and competing for space and soil resources. Biological interactions also unroll at different scales. They can be microscopic, as is the case of endosymbiosis, the most famous one being the one between eukaryotic cells and their chloroplasts. I will not go into details about this, because I imagine that if you have reached your studies at this level, you have already been familiarized with this interaction. And then you can have interactions that go at macroscopic levels that can affect entire landscapes, and they simply start with the interaction between two organisms or two populations of organisms. A fascinating example about this is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the US after introducing wolves that created a predation interaction with the local fauna. I will put a link to the video in the upper corner so you can follow through with this. Plant interactions can also be classified into obligate or facultative. So obligate interactions are absolutely necessary for both of the organisms to be able to survive, whereas facultative interactions can either happen or not happen with different consequences for the fitness of the organisms, but usually their absence is not lethal. So, for instance, the rhizosphere is defined as the combination of plant roots and soil microorganisms, which, among others, include mycorrhizal fungi. This association provides nutrition for the fungus, but it also helps the plant to increase its underground absorption surface, because mycorrhiza function as extension of the roots, and thus they provide the entire plant with water and nutrients that it couldn't get otherwise. Mycorrhizal fungi also provide other services for the plant that we will discuss in a future lecture. So plants can definitely grow without mycorrhiza, as it has been experimentally shown. However, The roots are less developed, and as a consequence, the entire plant is less developed if it is not associated with mycorrhizal fungi. So this is a facultative interaction. The plant does not need the mycorrhiza to survive, but its performance is significantly enhanced if it does have them. On the other hand, chloroplasts are absolutely essential for the survival of the plants. Try removing all chloroplasts or just the chlorophyll from a plant and see whether it will survive. And as usual, there is an exception to this. Holoparasitic plants that have lost the function of their chloroplasts. But even these plants have some degenerated versions of chloroplasts, suggesting that over the course of their adaptation to holoparasitism, they gradually lost the chloroplast function since it no longer requires for them to be able to feed off of sunlight. I have another example about obligate and facultative interaction, which involves the reproduction of plants, my favorite topic. Senecio scolitus is a self-incompatible plant, which means that the cells in its pistil express a self-incompatibility locus, which can be recognized, or rather can recognize the self-incompatibility alleles of the pollen. So if the pistil recognizes a grain of pollen that carries the same incompatibility alleles as the plant that bears the pistil, this pollen will not be able to germinate and fertilize the plant. Whereas if there is no recognition of the alleles that the pollen carries on its surface, it will be able to germinate and fertilize the plant. So this Asteraceae plant requires pollinators that will carry the pollen from one plant to another and thus be able to cross-pollinate and produce seeds. This is an example of obligate interaction because without pollinators, the Senecio species will not be able to produce seeds. On the other hand, there is Labium amplexicoli, one of the species that I study, which is a Cleistrogamous species. In addition to these pretty open flowers, at the very base of this photo, you can see the small buds which correspond to closed flowers that can autonomously self-pollinate without the intervention of any pollinators. So the plant can self-pollinate in its closed flowers without any intervention of pollinators, or it can be cross-pollinated in the open flowers if pollinators are present. But even when pollinators are not present, thanks to these closed flowers, the plant will be able to produce seeds. So in this case, the interaction with the plant and its pollinators is facultative. So biological interactions can also be classified as intra- or interspecific, depending on whether they occur among organisms of the same species or organisms of different species. So once again, you can pause the video, look at these examples of interactions and think whether they can be intra- or interspecific. So let's go into a review of the different examples. Among the possible intraspecific interactions, we have competition. One example for competition was the reciprocal competition between seedlings of Centaureum erythrae, which I grow in the same pot or individually. And you can clearly see how plants grown in the same pot are much smaller because of their limited access to nutrients and space for growth. Another example of intraspecific competition is the competition between plants for pollinators, especially when pollinators in the environment are quite rare, as it happens more and more often in agricultural ecosystems. Another type of intraspecific competition is facilitation, where individuals from the same species can mutually aid each other to enhance their growth and fitness. This is the case of this Australian water plant, Phragmites australis, which grows in saltwater marshes. At very low densities of the plants, they are exposed to quite high levels of salinity and sulfides that are present in the marsh water, which inhibits the growth of individual plants. However, at high densities, they manage to create this microenvironment in which the salt in the soil is diluted the amount of sulfates in the soil is also reduced, which generally creates a better environment for their growth. And as the denser and closer Phragmites australis plants are growing together, the more beneficial effect they will have on each other's growth. So this is a typical case of intraspecific facilitation, kind of at the opposite end of the competition. Now, among the cases for interspecific, so between different species, we have, again, competition, where different plants can be competing, for instance, for sunlight. As you can see around the base of this tree, no other types of plants are growing, including these grasses, because they don't have access to sunlight. Another type of interspecific interaction can be facilitation. This is a photo that I took in the Macedonian mountains, and this is actually a pasture where a lot of sheep are grazing. And here you have these prickly bushes that the sheep absolutely don't like because they hurt when you chew on them and they're absolutely not digestible. And quite often in these patches of bushes you see these trees that are growing. And this happens because the tree saplings, which are very delicious for the sheep, are very quickly grazed if they grow outside of the protection of this prickly bush. Interspecific interaction is obviously parasitism, where one plant species is parasitizing another plant species, and pollination, where we have interactions between plants and insects or other types of animals, which facilitate the transfer of pollen from one plant to another. Herbivory is also a type of interspecific interaction where, again, we have animals, herbivores, that are grazing on the plants. And the rhizosphere, this association between plant roots and microorganisms, is also an example of interspecific. Classifying the interactions is a quite useful tool, but as we will see throughout these lectures, it is not a pretty straightforward task. For instance, interactions often depend on the environment. Whether they're positive or negative will be determined not only by the organisms involved, but also by the environment in which these organisms are found. An example about this we will discuss this example more in details later, but it involves alpine flowering plant species that have been grown in an experimental setting in the nature with two experimental plots. In the control one, the population of the plants was left intact as it is with its natural density, and in the removal plot, most of the plants except a few focal ones were removed, so we have lower density of plants, and hence we expect to have less intense interactions. This was done along a gradient of temperature, so at the highest altitude the temperature is the lowest, at the intermediate altitude the temperature is intermediate, and at the lowest altitudes the temperature is obviously the lowest. And here is the result of the study, where we have the effect on fitness of plant removal as determined by the temperature. Anything that is below the horizontal dotted line means that removing the plants has a negative effect on their fitness, and anything that is above the dotted horizontal line means that removing the plants has a positive effect on their fitness. So we can clearly see how this relationship is dependent on the temperature. At the lowest temperatures, we have a negative effect of increased plant density in the control plots on their fitness. This corresponds to the blue part of the plot here. At intermediate temperatures, whether you remove the plant or not, so whether the interactions are closer or not, doesn't really change the fitness of the plants. Whereas at high temperatures, the plants that grow at higher densities actually seem to have higher fitness. So bear in mind, classifying interactions as interactions with positive or negative outcomes on fitness can facilitate your life under some circumstances, but you need to be careful of the environment in which you have estimated these interactions. Another important thing is that quite often when we study interactions between two organisms because they're simpler to observe in this way. But interactions quite often are not only pairwise and are not only direct between two organisms. So in a direct interaction, we have two organisms that encounter each other and have direct effect on their fitness, as we have discussed in most of the examples so far. But you can have indirect three-way interactions in which you have, for instance, one organism that benefits from the interaction, and then it interacts with another organism in blue, which also benefits from this interaction. A typical example about this is, for instance, the three-way interactions between trees, their herbivores, and the insect holobionts. So the trees or any kind of plants that are eaten by herbivores are negatively impacted by the herbivores, whereas the herbivores are usually positively impacted by their insect holobiont. It's the equivalent of the commensal flora in the human, all these microorganisms that live in the guts of the herbivores and help them digest the usually undigestible cellulose from trees. So the herbivores are benefiting from their interaction with the insect holobiont, and thus the tree indirectly is negatively impacted by the insect holobiont. So this kind of indirect three-way or even more than three-way interactions has led to the definition of the term apparent competition, where two organisms which are seemingly not into direct interaction are still competing for the same resources. A very convoluted example about this was actually suggested by Darwin, who observed that bumblebees and red clover are in a positive feedback interaction where the bumblebees are facilitating the pollination of red clover. Now, mice feed on bumblebees, which means that they negatively impact the fitness of bumblebees, and indirectly they also negatively affect the fitness of red clover because they reduce the amount of available pollinators for the red clover. So this is a fairly simple example so far, but bear with me. You can also introduce cats in the equation that have a negative direct effect on the fitness of mice because they feed off of mice. But then they have an indirect apparent effect on the population of bumblebees because they help the bumblebees to not get eaten by mice, which means that they have an indirect effect on the red clover population that will be better pollinated by the remaining bumblebees. And we can go on further with this, adding cows in the equation, where we have a positive effect of red clover on cows because cows feed on this red clover, but hence it has a negative effect on the red clover that gets grazed by the cows. However, cows have a positive effect on the fitness of sailors or of the Navy Army, whose main food during the long transcontinental trips on boats was dried beef jerky. And hence, the sailors have a negative effect on the population of cows, obviously. But this means that the healthy, well-fed sailors will have a positive effect on the British US Navy that was among the most powerful and most efficient colonizing navies back in the colonizing time of the British Empire. I could not tell you the date, but we know how many British colonies were all across the world up until the 18th, 19th century. And so based on all this, Darwin hypothesized that cats have a positive effect on, indirect apparent positive effect on sailors through the fact that they help for the red clover to be more efficiently pollinized, which is then eaten by the cows, which are then feeding the sailors, which are then conquering new worlds. So to sum it all up, cats were indirectly responsible for the huge success of the British colonization throughout the world back in the time. So although Darwin's example was quite anecdotal, it goes without saying, today we know that interactions can have huge ramifications within an ecosystem. And just to illustrate this, here we have an example of a trophic network, so who eats whom or who feeds off of whom in an ecosystem. And you can see how complex this network of interactions is. So studying interactions is quite a complex task. which requires a lot of dedication and a lot of careful planning in order to make sure that you are observing the interaction that you're interested in and not some apparent interaction between organisms which has indirect effects on what you're actually interested in observing. So there is the question of how do we actually study plant interactions? And the very first way to go about this would be to simply observe them, right? So if we observe an interaction between plants and pollinators, we see the pollinator visiting the plant, which means that there is some kind of interaction between the plant and the pollinator. But what does this exactly tell us about the type of interaction that is going on between these two organisms? Well, sometimes not much, because I did define interactions between plants and their pollinators as usually mutualistic, mutually beneficial to both parties. But then we have this type of interactions which are deceptive, where the plants are, for instance, mimicking the female of the species, as is the case with deceptive orchids, and the male insects come, visit the orchids, try to mate with them, thinking that they have found a receptive female. It doesn't work out, and they fly on to the next flower, or hopefully for them, a potential mate. This is obviously beneficial for the orchid flower that is going to get pollinated, but it is not beneficial for the male insects that are losing energy every time they're trying to mate with these false partners. And there is the other side of these interactions where you have these bumblebees that have their serps, their trumpets, which are too short to access the nectar of these plants, which is situated towards the bottom of the plant. But they have not given up on harvesting the reward of these flowers because they can simply pierce the corolla of the plant and recover the nectar. As you can see, there is no contact of the pollinator's body with the anthers of the plant, so there is absolutely no pollination going on here. We have all the benefits that goes for the insect, and all the hard work that is given from the plant is for nothing. So observation can maybe tell us if there is an interaction or not, but we don't necessarily know what type of interaction it is and how it affects the two parties involved. And sometimes interactions are quite difficult to observe. Like in this photo, there is an example of an interaction going on, but can you see it? I'll just give you a second to look at it and maybe think about it. But here it is. In the middle of this bush, okay, the shrub's name, I don't know it, but what I just showed you is an oak sapling. The darker colored leaves correspond to a small oak sapling that is struggling to develop into a tree. So the same way that you cannot see it, this delicious juicy sapling is quite well hidden from potential herbivores, from potential grazers that would like to eat it in this bush. So sometimes you would very much like to observe the interaction, but it's simply not possible to do it unless if you have a keen eye and you know what you're looking. Another way to study plant interactions is through experimentation. We already saw some examples about how this is done. For instance, you can have these controlled removal experiments where you compare what happens with the plants when they grow at their natural density, natural population density, versus what happens when they grow individually or with reduced density. And if populations at higher density are smaller, have reduced fitness, then we know that there is negative interactions between the individuals of this population. And if their fitness is increased compared to the removal experiment, then we know that we have a positive interaction. Another experimental approach, especially when you're interested about the evolutionary outcomes of the interactions, is through selection experiments. So starting from the same experimental population, which is constituted of seeds from a common pool, we can have two populations that evolve independently in different experimental settings. So the top line corresponds to an environment without any other vegetation, so without any interspecific competition, whereas the bottom environment corresponds to an environment with other vegetation, so with interspecific competition. So for several consecutive generations, we can harvest the seeds from each of the experimental populations and then replant them in their corresponding environment. After repeating this enough times for evolutionary patterns to emerge, we can see whether these two environments have had some effect on the plant fitness by comparing the performance of the plants in their respective environments. So when you don't have the time to do experimental evolution over multiple generations, you can also study plant interactions via reciprocal transplant experiments. Here we have a theoretical example of two populations growing that have evolved into two different environments. The blue one has grown in an environment without competition, and the orange one in an environment with competition. So reciprocal transplant simply means that you take the seeds from one population, you transplant them in the environment of origin and into the new environment. So for the blue population, environment of origin is the one without competition, and the new environment is the one with competition. You do the same thing for the other population, the orange one, and then you see how plant fitness compares between their local and their transplant environment. So we expect that the fitness of the plants doesn't change when they're grown in their local environment. The fitness of the blue plants here corresponds to their ancestors, and same thing goes for the orange plants when grown in the environment with competition. However, when they're transplanted to another environment, their fitness should decrease if they're not adapted to the new environment. So plants grown without competition perform less well when they're transplanted, and same thing goes for plants with competition when they're transplanted in an environment without competition. Here is what this example looks like graphically. So orange, the orange line corresponds to populations that have been grown with interspecific competition. The blue line corresponds to plants that have been grown without interspecific competition. On the left are the results when both of these populations are grown in an environment without competition, and on the right, both of these plants are grown in an environment with competition. And you can see how that the blue population, the one that has grown without competition, performs much better than the orange one when they're both growing in an environment that is lacking all other plant species. And the inverse is true when both of these populations are grown in an environment with competition. So you can also combine the experimental evolution and reciprocal transplant experiments. And an example of this is this study that examined how competition affects the growth of white clover. So white clover plants were experimentally grown for 3 generations with this grass, Agrostis. And at the end of the 3 experimental generations, the seeds were collected, and the 4th generation of white clover was grown in 4 different environments with 4 different competing plants. So the plant of origin, Agrostis, and then 3 other types of grasses that this experimental population has never experienced before. So as you can see, the plant biomass is the higher when white clover has been grown with its competitor of origin, and it is much lower when it is growing with other grass species, which means that over the course of 3 generations, which is quite a short time, the white clover has adapted to avoid or to decrease competition with Agrostis grasses. We can also deduce if interactions between two species or two clades of species have evolved by comparing their phylogenies. What I'm showing here is a theoretical example. This is not an actual biological study of 2 phylogenetic trees. On the left is a tree of plants, and on the right is a phylogenetic trees of insect herbivores that feed off of these plants. The arrows connecting the trees in the middle correspond to the interaction, so which insects feeds off of which specific type of plant species. So you can see that the 2 trees have quite similar topology. This is quite circumstantial evidence, but it does point out to the fact that the plants and their respective insect herbivores have followed similar evolutionary trajectories. And this quite often happens if the 2 species have closely evolved together in response to one another. So how can we study these plant interactions based on phylogenies? How would you further test the circumstantial evidence of matching topographies between two phylogenetic trees? Could you test for matching DNA sequences between plants and herbivores? Could you test if the insects are resistant to toxic compounds in plants that are represented in their respective clades? Or could you compare the evolutionary times for the plants and the insects? Just take a break, pause the video, and think about this. And if you answered that all three possibilities are correct, you are right. Either of these methods can further bring circumstantial evidence that would confirm about the coevolution of plants and herbivores. So in our theoretical example, for instance, we can say that the blue clade of insect herbivores that is closely linked to the orange clade of the plants are linked through the plants. Here the plants are species that produce terpentines. These are secondary metabolites that confer herbivore insect resistance. And the insect herbivores in this blue clade are all terpentine resistant. So they have co-evolved in order to be able to feed off of these plants. And same thing goes for the black branches at the bottom. The plants produce phenols, whereas their corresponding insect herbivores are phenol resistant. So all of this, although it's still not direct evidence, indicates to a possible coevolution between the plants and the plant defense mechanisms and the insect herbivores that have been able to circumvent these defense mechanisms. And lastly, you can always model plant interactions. Models are a quite amazing tool because all you need is a pen and paper or maybe some computational power in order to draw some very interesting conclusions. So there are different types of model, like the analytical ones in which we can use simple mathematical expressions in order to be able to model the interaction between two organisms. Maybe one of the most famous one is this model that shows how the populations of prey and predator evolve over the course of time based on their demographic density. So as the prey abundance increases, the prey abundance is shown here in blue on the top curve. As it increases, you can see that with some lag behind, the predator population increases as well. And at some point, the predator population reaches a critical size, after which the prey population starts to decrease because it gets eaten too much by the predator. And this goes on in a cycle because when the prey population decreases to a certain point, the predator population is also going to increase because it no longer can be sustained on such a small population size. You can also have statistical models, as it has been shown by the study of the viola species, where we have fitted a linear regression to show how the intensity of the interaction, the intensity and the direction of the interaction changes depending on the temperature. And finally, you can have individual-based models, which are stochastic models that simulate the behavior of different individuals. Here is the competition between fishes that feed off of different nutritious patches in a habitat. And by simulating the behavior of individual fish and then summarizing it over the time, you can see how the whole population of different fish species evolves over the course of time. We will actually be seeing the basis of some individual-based modeling of competition in this lecture through an interactive game. So if modeling plant interactions or any kind of biological phenomenon is something that you are interested in, I do need to give you some warning beforehand. So bear with me because I really wanted to fit in this joke here. If you have seen The Big Bang Theory, in one of the first episodes, there is this joke about how a physicist has been hired to solve a farmer's problem. The farmer's chicken didn't lay any eggs. So the physicist did calculating and making these complex models and whatnot, and then he goes to the farmer and says, I have a solution to your problem of how to make your chickens lay eggs again. However, it only applies to spherical chickens that are in vacuum. So this, what I find to be a hilarious and very nerdy joke, is a good example of George Box's saying how all models are false and some are useful. All models are based on some sort of unrealistic assumptions which make the modeling process feasible. However, especially when you're modeling biological phenomena, you need to make sure that your assumptions are still realistic enough so that the models are actually applicable to real-life biological systems. Based on everything I said so far, there is no one perfect tool for the study of plant interactions. Natural observations in natural environments quite often provide only circumstantial evidence. Experimental evolution can take a lot of time and resources, and you need to make sure that you're simulating the correct environments and not something completely different. And like we saw, all models are false, albeit some of them are useful. So to study plant interactions is not a pretty straightforward process, but neither is the study of any other biological phenomena. What usually happens is you start with the observation of a putative interaction, for instance, between plants and pollinators. Based on these observations, you can formulate some kind of hypothesis or redefine the hypothesis that you already have and then experimentally test it in controlled environments. For instance, an environment with the presence of pollinators and an environment without the presence of pollinators. And then you can get some results which might go in favor of your hypothesis. In here we see that the plant that has been pollinated, the plant that has grown with pollinators, has produced more seeds than the plant that was grown without pollinators. So once you have these results, you can use them as input to model the evolutionary consequences. And here we have a fairly simple model that shows how seed production is going to linearly increase in relationship to the frequency of pollinator visits in plants. Now, what you can do is then further experimentally test the model's predictions. And in this case, by adding more pollination environments. For instance, here we have on the left a pollination environment with a lot of pollinators, on the right a pollinator environment with only a few pollinators. And you can see that contrary to the expectations of the model, our results show that as long as there are pollinators present in the environment, the seed production is going to increase. So based on this knowledge, we can improve the model with new input, showing how pollinator visits do increase seed production up to a certain level, after which seed production is maximized. And so once we have all of these conclusions on this specific model system, we can see if these conclusions hold for other natural systems by using other plant species to study them.